And hello once again, and welcome to this latest lecture series video thing about narrative voice through the work of Genette. This is the last of the narratology sort of videos that I'll be doing here. First was about time, second one was about mood, this one's about voice. And voice is basically the sort of narration and the characters that take place in a story. So before I get into this, if you have appreciated these videos I've done a whole bunch of them. You can always check out on the channel. There's loads of these sort of unscripted educational lecture video things. And if you do appreciate them, you can always support me by checking out some of my books or by supporting me on Patreon. But we're going to move on from there for now, and we're going to get into the actual video. So, narrative voice. Cool. Firstly, narrative voice is usually talking about things like the characters and the narration. Cool. Now, let's just first say here that the narration is separate from the perspective. In the previous video I did, which was about narrative mood, mood has to do with things like focalization. Focalization is the perspective from which a story is told and how far you are from the story that is being told. That is essentially what it is. The narrator is the one that tells the story. The focalizer is the one that sees or perceives the story. So narration is separate from the focalizer, and it's also separate from the writer. Okay? A lot of people seem to think that the narrator in a story is basically the writer, but that is not necessarily the case, especially when it is a character within the story. Now, the only exception really here is that very much specifically, except for real-world autobiographies and historical text, which, like, if it's written by the person about their own lives, then yes, the narrator is also the writer. But there is this idea of sort of the implied writer, right? It's sort of the narrator who is, you sort of expect to see through the text, which is different to an actual writer. Okay, but, so voice. Voice is about narration, generally. How is the story in a narrative, right? How is a story told to us? That is narration. That is voice. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple of things here about how it's told to us. Right, because you might just expect, oh, are you going to talk about like a omniscient narrator, third person narrator, first person? No, not going to talk about those. We're talking about other stuff. Fun. So, when is a story narrated? Okay, you get subsequent narrating, prior narrating, simultaneous narrating, and interpolated narrating. Okay, basically, when is the narrator telling the story? Are they telling the story after it happened? So past tense? Are they telling it while it's happening, which would be present tense? Are they telling it before it happens, which would be future tense? Or are they telling it like basically between scenes? Is it like all jumbled up? Right, those are the four that Genette sort of looked at. So subsequent narrating, right, is in past tense. John went to the shop because he wanted to eat food. Subsequent, it happens after. Prior narrating, John wants to go to the shop and he plans to get himself some food. Future tense, right? You're basically telling it before it happens. Simultaneous, John is walking toward the shop because at this moment he is particularly hungry. Interpolated would basically be much broader, so it's difficult to just give a single sentence definition like here or example because you're sort of jumping between things. But essentially that is the time of the narrating. Does it happen before, after, during, or somewhere in between those things? When is the person narrating? When is the narrator telling us the story? Are they in the story? Are they outside the story? Why are they telling the story this way? When are they telling it to us? Cool. That's why you then get into the idea of narrating levels. Right? You get extradiegetic, intradiegetic, and meta/hypodiegetic, depending on who you ask. Meta and hypo are the same thing, but basically that comes from a disagreement about the use of the word meta. So basically, extra, intra, meta, diegetic. So let me first just say, I've said this in one of the previous videos, diegesis is an important term to understand. It's related to mimesis. So diegesis is basically telling something. It is textual. Mimesis is imitation. So this would be, how is the story told? At what level is it told? Is it extra diegetic? So think diegetic, the text. Extra, is it basically like kind of outside of that story? So this would be the narrator of the first narrative. It's the person that is telling the story. Intradiegetic is the actual events that take place in that first narrative, whereas metadiegetic is basically a narrator like within the diegetic, so like a narrator in a narrator. Or a narrative in a narrative, rather. So think of like a story in a story. It's not just, it's not inside or outside of, it's somewhere in between and within. Which makes it a little bit annoying to look at these kinds of things. This especially becomes true when it comes to a lot of sort of postmodernist novels. Genette was very concerned with postmodern novels. Like his book Narrative Discourse is about Marcel Proust's work, which is it's sort of foundational text for postmodernism. So that's what he was looking at a lot of the time. But most of the time, you're going to be getting those extra intradiegetic narrators, right? Who is telling the story, and then the actual events that are taking place within that story, and then also a character who could be within the story, telling the story as like a metatextual narrator. Okay. Now you also get types of narrator. All of these things are related to each other. The time of the narrating levels, and the types of narrator. Types of narrator. Homodiegetic, heterodiegetic, intradiegetic, or extradiegetic. Okay. These are all important terms, and I've also said this before, but yeah, I'm going to say it again now, because some people are not as familiar with the terms homo and hetero outside of a sexual context, because obviously homo as in homosexual, hetero as in heterosexual, but that's not what this means. Homo means same, and hetero means different, other. So, homodiegetic is same as text. Heterodiegetic, different to text. Intradiegetic means basically within the text, and extradiegetic outside the text. Okay, so types of narrator, according to these four things. Homo, hetero, intra, extra. Which one is it? Okay, if it's a homodiegetic narrator, it is a narrator who is a character in the story, right? They are the same as the story. Think about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was generally narrated from the perspective of Watson. So he is a character in the story who is narrating the events of the story, right? He's in it. Then you get heterodiegetic, a narrator who is absent from the story. They're not actually in the story. You could take something like, I don't know, The Book Thief, right? Well, you could say that the narrator is there, but it in a metaphysical sense. In that, the narrator is death. The concept of death, the personification of death, is the narrator. They're not actually a character. They do essentially kill people in the story, but they're not actually a character like within the story necessarily, right? So they're kind of absent from the primary narrative. Intradiegetic means that they are intrinsic to the narrative. So basically, is this character important to the story or not? If they're extradiegetic, they're not important to the story. That could be like an external viewer who is seeing things but isn't actually part of the story. So like think, okay, the narrator is a character who is in the story. Right? They are an actual character that is taking place in the story. That's taking part in the story. Intradiegetic. If they are a character who is not actually part of the primary events, like say they're watching from afar, they're extradiegetic. Okay. So now that is narrating in sort of a nutshell, right? When are you narrating? On what level are you narrating? And what type of narrator are you? Okay, so then as two little additional concepts that have to do with voice, I've sort of put them in a little box here at the bottom, whereas metalepsis and mise en abîme, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I've only ever read it. I'm one of those people that I read the terms, I don't hear the terms. So metalepsis. Basically, meta generally means something that is beyond the thing, whatever it happens to be, right? So that's when you talk about, say, something being metatextual. It's sort of beyond the fiction. Think about like Deadpool, right? Deadpool breaking the fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall, and talking directly to us. That is metatextual. He is a character, but he is very much aware that. Oh, my alarm just went off. Thank you, alarm. You know, I mute everything, but of course an alarm doesn't listen to muted things. Anyway, let's ignore my little alarm there. So metalepsis, right, is when the character enters when the author enters the reality of the fiction. So think about, it could be either the actual narrator is entering, or the story is entering the world of the narrator. It could be one or the other. They're two sides of the same coin. So basically when the distinction between author and fiction become jumbled with each other, right? So there could be, for instance, the author making known in a story that, oh no, I'm actually in charge of these events. I determine what happens in the story. If a narrator says that, it's essentially the author coming forward to sort of say, I'm controlling things. I'm like a god in this world. That is what you can do if you wanted to, if you were a certain type of writer, right? So it's basically, or it could be the other way around, where like, say, something like 6 Characters in Search of an Author, which is a play by name who I now cannot remember. Whatever. Basically, characters become sentient and they leave the page and they are in pursuit of their author. They're trying to find the person who made them. That is very meta, right? So that is metalepsis. It's essentially the reality of the authors entering the fiction. Okay, then mise en abîme, whatever, however you say that, is basically a story within a story that forces a reader to have sort of different states of the narrative, to look at different states, right? So it's essentially reflection on the text within the text. So think about a story within a story. You are learning different things as the story progresses, which then forces you to consider the story as a story and not as something that has a suspension of disbelief, right? So you know it's a story because the story is trying to tell you about itself. It sounds quite complicated, but like it sort of, think about a murder mystery, right? A murder mystery, you get information constantly that forces you to reassess what you are engaging with, right? It is constantly changing, constantly adapting, constantly more information is coming out that is changing the way that you are thinking about this thing. That is basically mise en, whatever. It is trying to get the reader to engage on a deeper level with the concepts that are being explored. Okay, all of that is basically narration. Alright, now I'm going to quickly talk about person, which is not actually related to narration necessarily. It can be, it's not necessarily, but that's because when this was done in like specifically the study guide that I'm using to explain some of these concepts, they lumped person in here. Genette didn't really talk about person, but other people like Rumon Keenan and Baal, they did talk about person here. So we're going to talk about person as well. Person is character, right? Characters. So I'm going to very, very briefly talk about a few different character theories. I love character theories. I sort of developed my own little character theory. One day I might return to that and actually do an actual in-depth thing about characters, which could be quite interesting, but I'm not going to do it now. Okay, so some different theories about characters. Forster's theory, Ian Forster, he probably is the most famous one. Flat and round characters, right? A flat character is a character that's not really important, they're not really fleshed out much, and a round character is a character who is very 3D and they're developed. We know about them, we understand their motives, their ideas, blah 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 blah. Think about like a protagonist would be a round character, and some random character they meet at a shop, that's a flat character. Fokima went into the idea of types versus individuals. It's essentially the same thing, but changing the language. A type is flat, an individual is round. Then you get essentialist versus existential, which is Pickrell's theory of character. This is also a similar kind of thing. An essentialist character is a character that is just their essence, right? So they're basically flat. It's their purpose in the narrative is to be the shopkeeper who the main character talks to once. That is their entire purpose. Existential characters, or existentialist characters, have an existence. They matter. They actually have character and personality and thoughts and ideas. They have their own existence. Then you get Hockman. He has a very sophisticated one, which is basically a character theory based on various binaries. But you combine the binaries together. So it's things like complex versus simple. But there's 8 of these different binaries. So together, you basically get like a complex, introspective, whatever character. It's like 8 different categories. So there's 64 different possible character types based on that, which is interesting. But, going into it would take a long time. So we're not going to do that. Then you get Harvey. And basically he has a protagonist, background, a ficelle, and a card. Protagonist is essentially a round character, and a background is basically a flat character, and then a fursona and a card are ones that are in between those, essentially. Then you get Fishelov. Fishelov looks at, and this is where it gets quite interesting, the idea of there's a difference between the construction level and the textual level. Okay, the construction level of a story is like the actual story. The textual level of a story is the actual text, what is written. Alright? So, what is written versus what is presented to us. Like, what is the story versus how is it shown? And you can basically look at this on like a graph, right? A character can be flat or they can be round, but are they flat? If they're a pure type, if they're purely flat, basically they'd be on the construction level, they would be flat, and they'd be flat on the textual level. But you could have a character who's like a type-like individual. We know more about them, but they basically are still flat. So you see, they're on a construction level, they're flat, but on a textual level, they're more round. You see, so you think of it as an X and a Y axis. How much information is given versus how much is like presented to us. It's a more sophisticated way of looking at character. One day, I think I will one day do a video about character, but not like one of these ones. It'll be like a proper scripted long thing. Alright, so anyway, the last thing I'm just going to talk about here in terms of character is characterization. Characterization is basically how you explore a character and how you show that a character is their own person, their own unique individual, right? And you can either do characterization indirectly or directly, right? Directly would be saying, John was a bad person. There we go. You're directly telling the audience John was a bad person. Indirect would be saying, John kicked a puppy. We don't have to be told John is a bad person. He just kicked a puppy, right? So direct versus indirect. And then character building is all of the culmination of characterization that leads to a character being built up. Alright, so that's pretty much that. I went very, very quickly through the person stuff. I went much more into the actual narration stuff, but that's just a very, very quick overview of person. So that is this video about narrative voice through the work of Genette. So I hope it has been beneficial, and that's pretty much it. So if you did appreciate this, if you enjoyed this, what have you, you can support me if you would so desire, because this is going to actually be my final year of these videos, these unscripted videos about these literary topics, but I'm doing a lot of them. I'm doing like a lot of them. So it should be quite an interesting time. So if you appreciate it, you can check out some of my books, or you could support me on Patreon. Both those would be very, very helpful. Or, of course, if you want to be very, very fun and not spend money, then you can do the other thing, which is like, comment, subscribe, whatever, all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I hope that you have a great day, weekend, month ahead, and goodbye.